Genesis chapter 15, verse 7 says this, Then the Lord said to Abraham, I am the Lord who led you out of Ur in Babylon to give you this land as your own. This week is an interview with Nick Gray in response to last week's controversial interview with Stephen Sizer. I'm with Nick Gray, the director of Christian Middle East Watch. Now, Nick, what is Christian Middle East Watch?
Well, Paul, Christian Middle East Watch is a Christian organisation, but we're dedicated to bringing objective facts and history and balance to the discussions on the Middle East, which are so often driven by emotion and rhetoric rather than by actually hard facts.
Now, we just done an interview recently with Stephen Sizer, and he believes in replacement theology. Stephen says God's call to the Jews is to Jesus and not to the land. Would you agree with that?
Well, as a Christian, Christians obviously believe that our call for all of us across the world is to Jesus, whether we're Jews or Gentiles. And I would actually agree with something else Stephen said, which is that the only true reconciliation comes about through Jesus. However, obviously, I don't push that, particularly on my Jewish friends, because it's such a tense issue. One of the passages that Stephen quotes is actually Hebrews chapter 11. He says that Abraham, who's the father of faith, was looking forward to a city whose architect and builder is God. In other words, to a spiritual city, and he wasn't looking forward to a land or seeking for a land. Well, actually, a few verses before that, in verse 10, it says that by faith, Abraham obeyed God and went to a physical place that God had told him to go to, went to a land, and God actually said, I'm giving you this land as your inheritance. And of course, that land, when God said that to him, he was standing right on the peak of what we now call the West Bank. And that was the middle of the land that God was giving to Abraham and his descendants. So, in a sense, it's both and. God says also in Ezekiel chapter 36, he says to the Jewish people in Israel, he says he's going to cause them to return to the land first. He said, I'm going to bring you back to the land. He says, then I'm going to pour clean water on you. I'm going to put my Holy Spirit in you and cause you to obey my laws. In other words, they're going to come back to the land first, and then he's going to bring them back to himself.
So they'll actually be rebellious first when he brings them back to the land?
Well, I don't know, maybe rebellious or not, but I think the picture that's painted is that God promised Abraham and his descendants a land, that wherever they went in the world through exile, God would bring them back to that land, and at some point he will bring them back to himself. So I think we've seen a great return to the land, going right back to the 1880s and the pogroms in Russia, a great return of Jewish people to their homeland in what we now call Israel. And we can see Jewish people returning to God in different ways. But I think we're seeing God's promise fulfilled, even if we disagree on whether individual prophecies are being fulfilled. I think the promise to Abraham is very much being fulfilled in our day.
Now, in 1948, the Jews came back to the land. So do you see that as a fulfillment of prophecy?
I think it can be seen as easily as a fulfillment of several different prophecies, and I wouldn't disagree with that, but also I think I would rather go further back. As I say, I want to go back to the original promise to Abraham, and whatever happens, whether it's with exiles or returns or God being pleased or displeased with his people, there is still a promise which is still in force today.
Now, if God has brought the people back to the land, what do you think of Stephen's assertion that the Palestinians should be given a state based on 1967 borders?
Well, of course, we now have a confusion in that there are a mixture of peoples in the land. A lot of those people came in when the Jewish immigration began, because the Jewish immigration created jobs and industry. So Arabs from the surrounding countries came in. So now, in the land, you have a mixture of peoples, and of course it's causing problems. It causes problems in Jordan, and it causes problems in Lebanon, and it's causing problems in what is now Israel. And there's a lot of play made about Palestinians having a right to a state based on the 1967 borders. I think the first thing to recognise is that there has never, until Yasser Arafat came along, been a defined people group called the Palestinians. Because we know that the Romans renamed what had been called Israel, renamed the whole general area around there Palestine in AD 135. And it's never been a defined state. It's never had a capital of Palestine. It's always been under occupation of some sort or another down through the centuries, whether it's the Ottoman Turks for 500 years or whether it's the British after the First World War and so on. I think the problem is that, and again, as Stephen says, he said that the British divided up the land unfairly. Actually, it wasn't Britain that divided up the land. Britain had so much problem trying to reconcile the claims of the two groups of people, that's the Arabs living there and the Jews living there, that they actually handed the whole issue back to the new United Nations after the Second World War. And it was the United Nations created a partition plan. It was the United Nations in 1947 who offered the Palestinians a state. Whether you claim that it was on 50% of what they should have had, or whether the Jews were offered 50% of what they didn't have, the fact is that the United Nations created a partition plan which would have enabled the Jews to have the homeland promised to them under previous international law, and would have enabled the Palestinians to have a state. And the Palestinian Arabs refused. And ever since then, they have, as has been said, they've never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And they turned down peace then, and they've turned down the offers of peace and of a state several times since, including in 2000, which led to the Second Intifada in the negotiations there. So under international law in 1947, the land from the Jordan River to the sea had already been given as a homeland to the Jewish people. The Arabs had been given the area to the east of the river, which we now call Jordan, which is a Palestinian state. And there were no Palestinians as such. The Jews were actually known as the Palestinians. You know, the Jerusalem Post used to be the Palestine Post. The Arabs called themselves Syrians. They didn't want to be known as Palestinians. So it's all a bit of a mix-up. And I think to say that they have a right to a state based on history is a false claim, quite honest with you. If they want now, as they are, to say, well, we are a separate people now and we want some self-determination, that is another issue. Now, of course, the second thing is the 1967 borders. And they are not borders. Okay, we need to get that straight. In 1949, when Israel's War of Independence ended, there was a line on a map which happened to be where the Jordanian and Israeli forces were when they agreed to a United Nations ceasefire. It could have been several miles one way or the other, depending on how the fighting had gone. It was not, and was never intended to be, a permanent border. So today, when people talk about a state based on the 1967 borders, there is no such thing as a 1967 border. It was a ceasefire line. And actually, if you were to talk to people, to Jews and to Arabs, that were around living in the area between, say, 1967 and the end of the 1980s, they would tell you of many cases where Jews would go and shop in Arab markets in the West Bank, Arabs would go and shop in Jewish villages. As settlements began to spring up, Arabs would come and settle on the edge of the settlements so that they could trade with the Jews. You know, the issue of this 1967 border became hardened when Yasser Arafat came along and the Oslo Accords were made. And of course, it was hardened again when Israel was forced to put up a security barrier to stop the suicide bombers in the early 2000s.
So now, what do you think of the security barrier? Stephen says it's a land grab designed to steal the land. Would you actually agree with that?
No, I wouldn't. He actually says 2 or 3 times in your interview that the wall, as he describes it, is designed to steal the land. We know that 90% of it is a fence and not a wall. It was built in response to the killing of hundreds of Jewish civilians by suicide bombers who were coming out of what we call the West Bank into the main body of Israel. And the last straw was the murder of almost 40 innocent Jewish civilians by a suicide bomber at Passover in 2002, just a few miles from the Arab villages of the West Bank. And Ariel Sharon and his government knew they had to do something to stop this happening. The security barrier has not been built as a permanent border. It can be taken down or moved at any time. It is a temporary security barrier. No terrorist murders, no barrier. Suicide bombers, we put a barrier up. And that is essentially what happened. If it is such, as Stephen says, a premeditated land grab, then why has Israel's High Court enforced changes of its route along 40 to 50 kilometres of its length to take account of the hardship being caused to Palestinians? Why did Israel take the trouble to go round such an intricate route as they have done, if you look at a map, when she could have taken lots of shortcuts, made the barrier a lot easier and taken a lot more land? And the reason is because it is not intended to be permanent, and if they can take a route which will help them with security, then they will take that route. Actually, the Israeli High Court, which is presided over by a Jewish Israeli, ordered the army and the contractors to change the route simply to lessen the hardship of Palestinians who had brought a claim against them. So the idea that Israel is stealing land, that Israel is creating a state for Jews and wants as few Arabs in it as possible, is completely false. I mean, actually, since the Oslo Accords, 10,000 East Jerusalem Arabs have become Israeli citizens. That doesn't sound like not wanting Arab citizens to me. And of course, we know full well that there are Israeli Arabs in the Israeli High Court as judges, as members of the Knesset, and there was even an Israeli Arab Miss Israel one year. You know, so it's really a rather false claim to say that Israel is just trying to steal land. They're not trying to steal land at all.
Now, 7 years ago, Israel left the Gaza Strip, and we can all remember the pictures of Jews being forcefully removed from Gaza. Stephen says Israel didn't leave. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, he also says that Israel is driving the Palestinians into the desert. I think I was actually out there in Israel in 2005, and it was a very painful move, which one has to say was forced on Israel, partly at least by the Americans. And the theory was that if Israel leaves Gaza, there will be peace, because you're moving out of a situation of occupying a country and you're leaving it to get on with its own life. And actually, since then, even the people on the left of Israeli politics who advocated leaving Gaza have said it was a mistake. And the reason is quite simple, because Israel took every single Jew out of Gaza, and in return for peace, and in return, instead of peace, they got rockets. And of course, just a couple of weeks ago, we saw the latest conflict as a result of these rockets being sent from Gaza over into Israel. Now, sadly, since the Israeli withdrawal in 2005, Gaza has been completely taken over by Hamas, which, as we know, is an Islamist group, a fundamentalist Islamic group. One of the questions that Stephen asks is, why would some Islamists want to destroy Israel? Which sounds as if Israel has done something to this one particular group of Islamists in Gaza, and therefore they want to destroy Israel. It has to be said that every Islamist, from Indonesia to Iceland, if there are any in Iceland, I don't know, wants to see Israel destroyed. It's not just a Hamas thing. It's not just a Gaza thing. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt would like to see Israel destroyed. Hezbollah in Lebanon would like to see Israel destroyed. It is not just Hamas at all. And it's not because of Israeli occupation of Palestinian land. It's just because they're Jews. For example, Israel has done nothing at all to harm Iran, but Iran wants to destroy Israel. Why? Because they're Muslims and their holy scriptures tell them that Jews are to be destroyed and killed. And so that is why they have these policies. Stephen says that peace between faith communities comes through mutual respect and toleration. I completely agree with him. But if one side offers toleration and the other side offers rockets, how can you bring peace between those faith communities? And this is why Israel, who's been very patient through years of rockets being fired at them, finally, every now and then it gets too much and they have to respond militarily. It's sad, and I don't think there's an Israeli soldier that wants to kill Palestinians in Gaza, but that's what happens when you keep sending rockets over to the other side.
Now, Stephen says Israel is an apartheid state and not a democracy. How would Jews fare in a Palestinian state, do you think?
Yeah, there is the idea that if there was a Palestinian state, that somehow some Jews might be able to live there. Well, Israel is the only state in the Middle East which is not apartheid. We will have to remember that in 1948, as the Israelis declared, as the Jewish state of Israel was declared in Tel Aviv, the Arab states right across the Middle East were ejecting all their Jews. So Israel is the only state in the Middle East which is not an apartheid state. So when we hear Mr. Abbas stand up and say, when I have my state of Palestine, there will not be a single Jew living in it, well, to me, that is just as apartheid as the rest of the states in the Middle East. And it's very sad, because actually if the Middle Eastern states were to allow Jews to come and go and trade with them, they would have the most tremendous benefit, as the West is getting from Jewish inventions and from Jewish technology. And it's because they have an apartheid attitude and Israel doesn't, that unfortunately that sad state of affairs has come about.
So is there anything else you'd like to say in response to Stephen Sizer's interview that we've done?
Well, I have to say, Paul, there are things that I would agree with Stephen. You know, some of his definitions of peace and the fact that this is very much a faith issue. I haven't got any problem with that, nor with the idea that you can be both pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian. But I'd just like to end this by bringing in one point, that Stephen says that the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions campaign, which is known as BDS, he says that it's a non-violent way of the international community saying to Israel, you won't get away with it anymore. The BDS movement is not the international community. The BDS movement, which came out of the Palestinians themselves, it's a collection of disparate groups, and often their only common factor is that they hate Israel. And they want to see a Palestinian version of the one-state solution, i.e. the eradication of Israel, the only democratic state in the Middle East, the only truly democratic state in the Middle East. The biggest organisation in Britain in the BDS movement is the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And if you look at their website and you look at their logo is a map of Palestine from the river to the sea, which really says it all. BDS is not the international community, which actually supported Israel in its latest conflict with Gaza. And while the international community was supporting Israel, the BDS groups were demonstrating against Israel in London. And one has to say that for all the efforts about boycotts against settlement goods and so on, that trade between Britain and Israel is growing all the time. And there are many connections and cooperations being made between British companies and British entrepreneurs and their Jewish counterparts, which rather kind of puts to shame and brings to nothing all these efforts to boycott Israeli goods by these organisations.
Now, people get more information from your website. What's your website address for people who'd like to know more?
It's cmew.org.uk, and our blog, where we put out more regular current information, is cmewonline.com.
And you're on Facebook as well?
Yes, we are, CMEW, yes. And Twitter, which is @CMEW2.
Okay, Nick, thank you very much.